Well, on Sunday evenings, we've been doing a really brief series, just 3, and this is the third one, it's the last one, on looking at one or two practical things to do with the whole matter of what is often referred to as personal evangelism. That is, you're talking to people about Jesus. And there's one verse which in many ways has been fairly seminal to this little series, which is 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. But in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord, and let me get this, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. That is, as a Christian, you are to be ready, and I'd like to add, raring to go, to speak to others about your faith. And in particular, the way in which Peter puts that, he puts it in such a sense that we should be ready to respond when people ask us questions. Always be prepared to answer everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. So it's my prayer for you and for myself that as we live out our Christian lives, seeking to be salt and light in the midst of our very needy communities, our families, our world, whatever it may be, that our lives will provoke questions. Our lives will provoke people to simply ask, and to put it in its crudest sense, what makes her tick? Why is he the way he is? I told you before that years ago I had a lovely opportunity to go and speak in the Christian Union at Aberystwyth University. I'd not been before, I was a little bit nervous, so I sat in the front row and an Asian chap sat next to me, and I asked him, I said, have you ever been, do you come here regularly? He said, not at all. He said, I'm a Muslim. I've never been before, but I'm here tonight because there's a boy on my course who says he's a Christian and I'm impressed with his life. That's a remarkable thing, isn't it? And I've often reflected on that over the years, and I've thought, I wonder if there have been times when I've had that effect on people's lives. I hope there have been. And certainly I hope there have been times when simply by the integrity with which we live, the kindness, the love, and all of these things, that we provoke questions so that people ask us, well, what is it about you? Why are you different? At which point we have that wonderful opportunity to do as we were looking at here this morning in Romans 10:17. Faith comes through hearing the message. The whole purpose of personal evangelism, of course, is to explain the message. Now, last time we looked at the title Head to Head. Tonight we're going to look at Heart to Heart. When we looked at Head to Head, we were looking really about the reality that we live in a world of ideas. Ideas about faith and religion are everywhere. They're particularly active at the moment. And you read the more thoughtful newspapers and magazines, you'll find at the moment, almost in every magazine, there is something about faith, something about God, something about religion. And as Christians, we need to engage with the ideas that people have. As wrong as those ideas may be, we need to engage with people where they are, with the news of the gospel. And we looked at the example of Paul's evangelism at Athens in Acts 17. For the reality is that there are many people for whom the barrier in their life to exploring the gospel is actually a barrier that we might say is intellectual. It's the barrier of an idea. And so you know people who say to you sometimes, well, actually, surely science has disproved God. There's no need for God in the world anymore. Science has explained most things anyway. Or someone might say to you, well, of course, the Bible is full of contradictions. Because if somebody believes that, they're not going to read it, are they? Who wants to read a book full of contradictions? Or someone might say to you, well, all religions are the same. So, frankly, I'm very busy with the life I've got. I haven't got time to sit down and listen to one. They're all the same. These are intellectual barriers. They are barriers of ideas to exploring the gospel. And I want to suggest tonight that the really big one that people have is the one that, God willing, we're going to touch on next Sunday evening in the living room. Why does God allow suffering? Or where is God when there is suffering and hurt in the world? Now this question, why does God allow suffering, is also a very helpful way into our theme this evening. Because often the ideas that people have about God and faith are rooted in real deep feelings as well as strong ideas. Often the objections that people have, or the reluctance that people have to looking at the gospel, is as much a heart issue of feelings and responses that they have in their heart towards God and Christian things as it may be intellectual things. So, for example, someone may have a great feeling of disappointment because they've known a period of terrible suffering in their life, or they've seen a loved one suffering and they prayed. They sat at the side of their bed in the hospice and they prayed and they asked God to intervene, and there was no answer. God didn't take the pain away. And so they find themselves in a position where they were open to God and willing to God for God to act, but now perhaps they feel desperately angry with God. You know, it's interesting. I got one or two friends who were very, very strong atheists. They're really quite militant, quite angry. And when we get on the subject of faith, which we often do, it can be very interesting. I find, when I'm dealing with a really angry atheist, that actually I think more often than not, I'm dealing with somebody who is really angry with the God they claim they don't believe in. When I was in school, I remember studying Hamlet, and there's, I don't actually remember a great deal from Hamlet except one or two lines. And one of the lines is that they have to watch a play, and it's very clever. Shakespeare does it. There's a play that Hamlet and his family watch, which is kind of modelling what's actually going on in his family. And Hamlet sort of asks his mother at one point in the play, well, what do you make of this? He's trying to nudge her to see that there's a parallel between the little play that they're watching and what's actually happening in their family. To which his mother turns to him and simply says about the actress, who clearly is the mirror with herself, "The lady doth protest too much." And there are sometimes in life when you meet people like that, they are just a little bit too angry with God to make sense. It's a little bit too over the top. They're a little bit too irrational. And I want to suggest to you that when you find someone like that, you're finding somebody whose heart is deeply disturbed towards God. It is more than a rational intellectual rejection. Now, I want to open up to you tonight how we should perhaps begin to think about dealing with people with troubled hearts. And I don't want you to think that I'm just talking about folks who are just really angry atheists, but I want to broaden the lens. For we live in a world filled with people with troubled hearts. Now, you know that. And you know how you were perhaps before you became a Christian. Perhaps you remember how your heart was. Or maybe tonight, perhaps you're still not a Christian and you have a troubled heart. The Bible uses a fascinating phrase. I think it's a lovely phrase. It speaks about people who are broken-hearted. Now, it's not just a Bible phrase. It's in popular culture, isn't it? What becomes of the broken-hearted? It's in a lot of the songs that people have sung over the years, because the reality is, as human beings, our hearts can be deeply troubled places. But what does it mean to be broken-hearted? I think in the way in which the Bible uses this word, it's speaking about people for whom life has become unbearable or overwhelming. Maybe they've experienced suffering on a degree that they never imagined, or profound disappointment. They've been massively, catastrophically let down and hurt, deeply hurt. Maybe they know deep sadness, but whatever it is, the broken-hearted seem to have been outrun by the sorrows and the pressures of life. They've overtaken them. The heart, you see. So the Bible has a great deal to say about the heart. The Greeks used to believe it was the seat of the emotions. The heart is that place, that part of us where joy is really to be known, where love is to dominate, where there is to be delight and enthusiasm for life. But the broken-hearted have been robbed of all these things. It is a very lonely and desperate place to be broken-hearted, to lose the joy and passion for life, and the broken-hearted invariably turn in on themselves, weary, worn, and sad. Now, I want to suggest to you tonight that you don't need any major trauma to be brokenhearted in life. Major trauma may do that. Sudden, tragic bereavement, a terrible crisis in your life, a deep, profound, sudden, catastrophic difficulty. But I honestly think that in life there are a lot of people that don't hit those big issues that nevertheless are brokenhearted. They just look at the world as it is, and it all seems a bit too much. It just seems to get to them. These are sensitive people. These are people who are able to empathize. These are people who are caring. But there are times when they just look at the world and they see what's going on. They find themselves with a deep sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer reality of living in what we as Christians know is a fallen world. There's been a lot of fuss today about the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Headline in one newspaper, the Archbishop of Canterbury doubted God after the Paris attacks. And some Christians have responded extremely ungraciously towards the Archbishop of Canterbury. The reality is it's very selective journalism. If you hear the interview, you will find that he has been asked the question, and he offers the question himself, that in the midst of seeing the shocking reality of the extent of the evil that was done in Paris, he said he found himself wondering, where is God in all of this? And he immediately answers the question. He is in the middle of it, he said. He went on to point out Psalm 56, God stores up the tears of his people in a bottle. But in his example, I think you see a tension between, which reveals where a lot of people are today. There are a lot of folks who are just generally overwhelmed sometimes by just the sheer volume of trouble in the world. I was talking to some friends this morning after the morning service and saying that we live in a generation and an age where perhaps as people we have seen and we see more sorrow than any other generation, because it's on our news, in our televisions, in our newspapers. There is an immediacy, isn't there? There can be a terrorist incident or some trauma, a plane crash or something like that, an outbreak of Ebola or whatever it is, and within the space of a few moments, it's headline news. If you follow the BBC on your Twitter feed or something like that, suddenly it's there, breaking news. And we are drawn to these things, and we view these things, and we hear of these things, and they are pumped out into our ears and into our culture repeatedly, and the effect on so many is to be literally heartbroken by who we are and what we are as human beings. Now, the Christian has great comfort at times like this, as Justin Welby shows. He knows that God is in the middle of his troubles. He has those wonderful psalms that he goes to that remind him of God's kindness and generosity and faithfulness to his people. The Christian faces these things with great confidence. The Christian knows they're not alone. God is with us. He will never leave us nor forsake us. But for the person who is not a Christian, life is becoming increasingly more a burden because of the reality of the suffering in our world. And how do you cope? Well, you just keep plodding. You muddle through. You just keep smiling. You just keep pursuing those little holidays from the trauma, whether it's your hobbies or your interest or your indulgences or your sin. These things become all the more important as they distract from the reality of living broken in a broken world. Remember these words from the Beatles? All the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they all belong? We live in a world of broken people. Now, one of the great things the Bible speaks about is Jesus and troubled hearts. I think it's just one of the most beautiful themes in the whole of the Bible. Some of the great Old Testament messianic passages speaking of Christ coming specifically refer to him coming for the brokenhearted. Listen to these words from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. In fact, it seems that that was the scroll from which Jesus read for the first time, and he spoke in the synagogue in Nazareth, and they desired to stone him as a result of this. But that's the thing. When the Messiah comes, he will do many wonderful and glorious things. He will bring good news for the poor. He will proclaim freedom for prisoners. But he will also bind up the brokenhearted. Psalm 147, verse 3, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And Psalm 34, he is close to the brokenhearted. Clearly, Jesus cares deeply about broken-hearted people. Now, in our account this evening here in Luke 19, we are confronted with a remarkable man, a complex man, and a very needy man called Zacchaeus. I spoke on this not so long ago at a family service. We're going to go back to it this evening and look at it really, I think, in a very different way. Now, you know the story probably. I remember learning about it in Sunday school. Zacchaeus was a very little man, and a very little man was he. He climbed up into a sycamore tree for the Saviour he wanted to see. I can remember that little chorus absolutely ingrained upon me as a little boy. And the story of Zacchaeus is a very compelling one. It's a story of radical transformation. But it's also the story of a very deeply disturbed man. Now, he has all the appearance of great success. Verse 2, he was chief tax collector and was wealthy. Top of the tree. He is probably the biggest businessman in Jericho. He is the Alan Sugar of Jericho. But the reality is he is probably a deeply lonely man. As a tax collector, he is incredibly selfish. You know the system. Probably, if you're not sure how it used to work, the Romans would hold the equivalent of an auction. And they would be businessmen there, and they'd be bidding for the right to become a tax collector. Why? Because the Roman government, we aren't interested in a certain levy on the people. Well, tax collectors had the authority to extract whatever they wanted. So they could double it. They could take extra, and they would cream it off, and they would make lots of money out of working people. It was a kind of state-sanctioned exploitation. It would have rendered him, as the passage says, extremely wealthy, but also by implication extremely unpopular. Now, unpopular men become lonely men. And when you're lonely and isolated and friendless, it is a dreadful place to be in. Years ago, when I was a physiotherapist, I specialized in psychiatry. And I can remember sitting on a ward round, and the consultant psychiatrist was there, and a man had been brought in with a lot of needs in his life. But the conclusion was this man's need really is that he's lonely. And there's not really much we can do for him. He doesn't require medication. He doesn't require the kinds of treatments which are on offer. His problem is loneliness. Loneliness is an extremely debilitating thing in the human condition. And this man is about as lonely as you can get. And so he's clearly an unhappy man. Now, it's an interesting thing here that his willingness to pursue Jesus, verse 3, he wanted to see who Jesus was. He's curious, he's interested. And yet here's a man who, in one sense, has got everything. He obviously has a pretty fine house. He's very wealthy. He has the prospect of making lots more money, and yet he sees in a rabbi who literally only owns the clothes he's wearing something that fascinates him. It's a reminder, isn't it, that materialism ultimately doesn't satisfy. Something we have to be reminded of, I think, at this time of year. For all the messages about apparently loving one another that people like John Lewis would try to give us, at the end of the day, they're just interested in selling things and us buying things from them. And within its proper parameters, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But repeatedly, we have been sold the lie and the myth of materialism, which is that these things will make you happy. Well, of course, for a while they do. The new washing machine, or the new car, or the new whatever it is. For a while, it's very nice, it's very wonderful, and you're very glad you've got it. But as time ticks by, the gloss wears off, and what is new today becomes so yesterday, and the attraction diminishes. And so we find ourselves on the treadmill, continually pursuing and wanting more, to keep that sense of satisfaction alive, which is so temporary. I want to tell you this evening, you can't buy satisfaction. Not really. Not real satisfaction. And I think Zacchaeus knew this. It was Benjamin Franklin who once said, "Money never made a man happy, yet, nor will it. The more a man has, the more he wants. Instead of filling a vacuum, it makes one." And that's the reality. I think Zacchaeus knew that. And he's clearly an outcast, because later on in the passage, Jesus responds to his critics in verse 10 with, "The Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." And that was Zacchaeus. He was lost. He was regarded clearly by the crowd, who mutter and murmur when Jesus goes to his house, as being a sinner. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens in the narrative. I think it's often missed. In fact, if you look at verse 3 and verse 4, there is an awful lot being said here about this man. But it's said in such a subtle way and a nuanced way that we can so easily overlook it. There is not only amongst this lonely, unhappy outcast of a wealthy man, there is also a loss of dignity. Verse 4, "So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree." You see people running today, you might feel sorry for them, you might feel that they're mad, but there is probably in you, deep down inside, a certain degree, maybe only a tiny bit, but a little degree of admiration. Well, at least they're out there. Perhaps you see a rather large gentleman sweating and making his way along the road, and it's raining and it's cold, and he's there in his high-vis jacket. It's probably me, by the way, but you see someone like that. You think, well, at least he's out there having a go. Good for him. Could be sat on his backside in front of the TV, just getting bigger. He's making an effort, and there's a bit of admiration. You know that. But not in Jesus' day. The culture in which he lived, running, was something that servants did. And a man of Zacchaeus' business credentials to run would be absolutely demeaning. And yet he willingly runs. And if that isn't enough, he climbs a tree. Here is this wealthy businessman running, climbing a tree. What is that suggestive of? Here is a man who's lost all self-dignity. He is a miserable man. His sorrows have led to a loss of self-esteem and a profound loss of dignity. He is about as broken and lost a man as there can be. Lonely, isolated, with loss of self-dignity and loss of credibility in the community. Now, look what Jesus does with him. And I think it's at this point we can see perhaps some things that we ought to take on board as we seek to reach out to broken people in our culture with the news of the gospel. Now, I think this story operates on two levels. The primary level is the clear intended original meaning, which is very much in this passage, as you know. It's revealing to us something of Jesus' deity. He stops under the tree, verse 5. He looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus." How did Jesus know his name? How did Jesus know he was there? It's a reminder, isn't it, that he is God. And then, of course, there's Jesus' compassion. What he has to offer, the news of the kingdom of heaven, is for tax collectors. It goes right to the edge of society. And of course, the big thing is that Jesus has transforming power. Verse 8. "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. If I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." That's a miracle. A transforming miracle. A man who lived to squeeze the last shekel out of the poor now can't wait to pay it back. It's a reminder that Christ changes people. And then most powerfully in verse 9 and verse 10, there is the news that Christ has come for the lost. Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. And this, of course, is the gospel. It's that Christ has come for lost, broken, smashed people. Smashed by the power of sin, in the grip of the power of sin. And he has not only come for them to identify with them, he has come to transform, to make new, to put back what sin has destroyed, to renew in his image and likeness. And all of this is possible because of what he has done on the cross. He has power to make people new. Now that's the primary message of this passage, and it's wonderful, isn't it? But I think there's a secondary message here as well, and it's seen in the way that Jesus deals with Zacchaeus. Now we have to remember certain things about Jesus. He is the one who says in Matthew 11, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart." This is what he's like. This is why it is to Jesus that mothers come with their babies for him to bless them. They know that he's approachable, that children come to him, lepers come to him, the broken and the needy come to him. He is gentle. He is humble of heart. He is the good shepherd. It's interesting, isn't it, that in the kind of text that's been driving this series in 1 Peter 3:15, but in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Peter adds, but do this with gentleness and respect. That as we speak of Christ, we speak as Christ. And so Jesus deals with this man not with an accusing finger, but instead with great tenderness and compassion. Do you notice what he does first of all? And this is really helpful now practically. I want you to think of this now in terms of you as you reach out to the broken around us. And there are so many of them. People who've lost all sense of self-worth and dignity. People who feel just so bashed up, smashed up by life, that are so isolated and lonely in their sense of self-despair. The first thing Jesus does is to address Zacchaeus personally. Zacchaeus, verse 5, come down. Now, we know that ultimately was a display of his deity, but it is also an expression of his compassion. Now, I don't know about you. You probably know me well enough, some of you by now, to know that I am absolutely rubbish with names. In fact, it's not just names, it's numbers and left and right as well, because I'm mildly dyslexic. When I first started in the ministry as to visit people, I would write their name on a piece of paper and hold it in my hand, because I was fed up of praying at the end and asking God to bless his son or his daughter or his child, because I couldn't remember their names. I could tell you all sorts of things about people, all sorts of things. All the detail is there, but just this little trigger, the name, just doesn't seem to register in there. In fact, it got so bad when we were in Pontefract in the church members meeting once. We were proposing something and Karen put her hand up to propose it. I forgot her name, just briefly. That's just how bad I am with names, okay? And I'm embarrassed about it and I'm ashamed about it, actually. It's something I battle with. Because it can appear that when you forget someone's name that you're kind of handling them superficially. It gives the impression that you're not really interested in them, that you don't really care. But you know, if there's one thing worse than handling someone superficially, it's being dismissive of them. Just totally overlooking them. They don't really matter. They're just in the way. You know, for broken-hearted people, when they're overlooked, when the impression is that you have no interest in them whatsoever, it just becomes another nail in their coffin. It's another reinforcement of the message that they don't matter. I think that's why, almost uniquely here, Jesus, we're told, uses this man's name, Zacchaeus. I know you. I know all about you. You see, this personal interest is something that we are to take in people for the kingdom of God. We're to be willing to reach out to people, to establish personal contact gently and persistently with the news that, yes, someone is interested in me. And as we do this, we begin to model the power of the gospel into people's lives. They get a glimpse of the deep concern that God has for people. Now, the next thing that Jesus does is that he restores this man's dignity. Verse 5, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. There's a forcefulness about our Lord's words there, isn't there? An immediacy. What in the world are you doing, Zacchaeus? You're a man. You're not to be sat in a tree like a bird or a monkey. Get out of that tree. You're better than this. You're more than this. And he reestablishes Zacchaeus' dignity with these words, I must stay at your house today. In other words, you're no longer a tree-hugging misfit, but you're actually a man. There's a dignity with which Jesus addresses Zacchaeus. I think something very interesting is happening here. Ultimately, Zacchaeus is clearly a sinner in need of forgiveness, and Christ will address this. And he does, because he tells us in verse 9 that salvation has come to this house. But the first thing that Jesus does is reach Zacchaeus in his point of shame. The man who has lost all sense of self-worth and dignity, that he's willing to run before the crowd, couldn't care less what anybody else thinks about him because he is so ruined inside about himself. And he sits in a tree, much to the mockery of other people, I am sure. Jesus restores his dignity and his self-worth. Now, I'm not entirely sure how this works out in practice for us. But I do want to say that broken-hearted people are often people robbed of dignity. They let themselves go. They give in to themselves. They go into themselves. And certainly we should be looking at ways of restoring dignity in people where we can. And here perhaps are some of the ways in which we can do this. We take them seriously. We treat them with courtesy. We give people time. We invest of ourselves in them. We listen to them. And we do all we can to take them seriously. And we do it for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Never dismissive, but all the time seeking to reassure them that they're a man or a woman or a boy or a girl made in the image of God. Now, the third thing that Jesus does here is that he reaches to Zacchaeus in his point of need. This man appears deeply lonely. And the picture of him in the tree, while the crowd is down on the ground, here he is apart from society in this place of embarrassment and awkwardness. It is to that very issue that Jesus speaks as he invites himself round to his house. Now, of course, we know that the moment Jesus does that, he invites tremendous criticism. Verse 7, all the people saw this and began to mutter, as people do. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. What kind of rabbi is this? What kind of nonsense is this about the kingdom of heaven? If he's willing to hang out with someone like Zacchaeus, everyone knows Zacchaeus is a sinner. And righteous men should have nothing to do with sinners, should they? But of course the reality is it was a wonderful, tender thing to do. Jesus is willing to run the gauntlet of the crowd to reach this man in his point of need. What is his greatest point of need? He's lonely. And here Christ says, I'm coming to your house for tea. It is entirely constructive about Zacchaeus' needs. There's something wonderfully restorative about this. And we have to believe that this was part of Christ dealing with Zacchaeus' heart, of softening him and melting him to the reality of who he is and the news of the gospel. And so we need to think carefully about the needs of others around us. And we need to reach out to them where they are. If they're lonely, we need to make ourselves available. If they're anxious, we need to make ourselves as people who are understanding and who listen and seek to help. If they're hurt, we must seek to do what we can to comfort. But as Jesus reaches Zacchaeus in his point of need as a broken-hearted man, we need to be mindful of the needs of those around us. Now, of course, the great thing that Jesus does, and the fourth and last thing, is that he brings the transforming power of the gospel. We don't know the conversation that took place. We don't know the ins and outs. But we know the outcome. And the outcome is transformation. And Jesus calls this transformation salvation. And the broken-hearted people in our world, the people overwhelmed just by the stress, the pressure of life, the direction that the world is going in, or people hit by the big traumas in life, ultimately their need is not simply for friendship, not simply for comfort, but ultimately their need is for the grace of God in the salvation that only Christ brings. Friends, there are a lot of troubled and broken-hearted people out there in need of the grace of the gospel. But in our reaching out, as we have seen here this evening, as Jesus reached out to Zacchaeus, we need to reach out gently, compassionately, intentionally, and deliberately, tenderly, and patiently. In your heart set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. We are called not only to preach the news of the gospel, but to demonstrate something of the grace of the gospel to those around us. So, during this week, as you go about your business, I wonder who you're going to meet. I wonder who you're going to be sat next to when you're in the cafe in town that you go to, or when you're in the queue in the post office, or when you sit down in your lessons at school. Who are you really sitting next to? Are you sitting next to someone with ideas that are barriers to the news of the gospel? Or maybe you're just sitting next to somebody who's broken by life. Well, whoever we're sat next to and wherever we are, may it be our prayer that God will open up opportunities for us to speak and to demonstrate the reality of his love in the gospel of his Son, Jesus Christ. There was a day, wasn't there, when someone took time with you. Maybe with you it was big questions. Or maybe it was just someone who took time with you as a person and reassured you and sought out to reach out to you. And that by that action it became a door for the gospel into your life. It's a wonderful thing. We reminded this morning that we are to preach Christ to the world. And may God help us as a church to be very earnest about this and active. And may there be many people this week that are reached by you and me with the news of Jesus Christ and his love.